Welcome to XYPN Radio, where your host Alan Moore brings you into a community of fee-only financial planners who want to profitably and successfully serve Gen X and Gen Y clients. If you're ready to get the knowledge you need from leaders in your field, learn from forward-thinking advisors, and take action on your own goals, XYPN Radio is the show for you. Here's your host.
Hello and welcome to this episode of XYPN Radio. I'm your host, Alan Moore, and I'm excited to have Michael Kitces on the show today to talk about an announcement that we made at XYPN Live in St. Louis this year. In September, we sued the SEC over Regulation Best Interest, also known as Reg BI. We've gotten a lot of great questions about the lawsuit, so we wanted to address them on this episode. We talked through the history of Reg BI and the fiduciary versus suitability rules and the RIA and the broker-dealer landscape that ultimately led to the mess that we are in currently. We discussed why we believe Reg BI is ultimately a bad rule and is an example of the SEC overstepping and creating rules that fly in the face of Congress's intent with both the Investors Act of 1940 and the Dodd-Frank Law in 2010. We finished up with a discussion of our goals for what comes next and the potential outcomes. It's going to be a fun year, and we'll try to keep everyone in the loop on what's going on with the lawsuit as we have more updates. XYPlanning Network's annual benchmarking survey is out. Are you curious about the average number of clients XYPN members get in their first year, or how successful niches really are? To answer these burning questions and more, we've again enlisted a professional research firm to complete our annual benchmarking study. Get your copy hot off the press and discover vital statistics such as the median advisor revenue by years in practice and sources of firm growth, from referrals to blogging, social media, and more. Head over to xyplanningnetwork.com/study to purchase your copy today. You can find any of the additional resources that we mentioned during the episode at xyplanningnetwork.com/228. Also, be sure to go to xyplanningnetwork.com/VIP to join our private group just for XYPN Radio listeners. It's the community of advisors we've all been looking for that's there to provide support when we need it the most. Best of all, it's free. I encourage you to check it out. Again, that's xyplanningnetwork.com/VIP. Without further ado, here's my interview with Michael. Hey, Michael, welcome back to the show. It has been a while, but I'm glad to have you back on.
It's good to be back. It has been a while. I think we're trying to get this fixed. I know we're going to queue up a couple of these over the next month or two here and get back on track. It's been a busy year.
That it has.
Sometimes this podcasting stuff slips away from us a little, so I'm excited to be back on track.
Yeah, and good prep for listeners that you'll be hearing from me and Michael for the next 3 weeks, assuming our recording schedules do not get changed. So we're shifting gears a little bit. We have some content that we wanted to get out there before I am going on sabbatical here at the end of November, which is about a month from recording, a couple weeks from when this will go live. So wanted to knock that out. And you're actually going to be hearing from a new podcast host for XYPN Radio while I am out. So I'll say that much just to tease it, and you'll be hearing more over the coming weeks. But yeah, you'll be hearing from a new podcast host here in November 25th-ish.
I got to pause you there for a moment, though. Like you've now put this out on the table, so I'm sure everybody's going to be asking. So sabbatical what?
Sabbatical. So here at XYPlanning Network, one of our team member benefits that we provide is a sabbatical every 5 years. And so we are 5 years into the business. Maddie, our first ever team member, director of member services, she took her sabbatical back in May, right at her 5-year mark. And so I was encouraged that I needed to take mine as well. One, just because it's been a long year. It's been a tough year. We had a change of leadership with our COO departing and hiring a new COO. So it's been kind of a long year. It's been good, but it's been tough.
Yep.
And so I'm excited to be able to go sort of get a break. I'll say calm before the storm. Some things we're brewing over here at XY the next couple of years are going to be
some exciting stuff coming. Absolutely.
So yeah, and also wanted to be sure the team understands that they can and are expected to actually take their sabbatical. It's kind of interesting, the science behind, unlimited vacation days is that people actually take less vacation than when you just give them 10 vacation days. So I want to be sure that when we give a sabbatical opportunity that people actually take advantage, even if that's a staycation sabbatical, which some folks will do because of family dynamics and situation and just what they choose to do. So yeah, I'll be going to the Canary Islands, going to learn how to scuba dive. That's what I've decided I want to do. It's something I've always wanted to do and have never taken the time. So I will be very tan coming back in January and hitting it for ski season. So
tan skiing in Bozeman, that should go over well.
Exactly. All right. Well, the topic for today's podcast is, if you haven't heard, XYPlanning Network sued the SEC. Always fun to sue your regulator because, with our XY Investment Solutions, it's currently registered in Montana, but soon to be in with the SEC. So always a fun decision to make. But we did want to take the opportunity to be able to just sort of talk through how that came to be and what our goals and expectations are and all of that. So Michael is our sort of subject matter expert on this, as with many things. So this is one of his accountabilities is owning and coordinating the lawsuit here. So I guess it starts with, I guess let's give a little bit of history lesson on Reg BI, because in the end, that is what we are suing to overturn. So I guess let's just sort of define Reg BI and what it means, and then go into a little bit of a history lesson on how this all came to be and where we're hoping it will go. So yeah, let's start it there.
So Reg BI is short for Regulation Best Interest. And Regulation Best Interest was the big proposal that the SEC put out last year in 2018, finalized in June of 2019 this year, that was essentially the SEC's response to all this debate back and forth of, it seems like broker-dealers are giving more advice, but they're not being held to a fiduciary standard. Don't we need to do something about that? And so there was a lot of back and forth about what the SEC might do and how they might handle this. So one set of proposals that's been out there for a long time says we need what's called a uniform fiduciary standard, which just means let's make one uniform rule, applies for all the investment advisors and all the broker dealers. And then we don't have to worry about who's which channel and are you wearing your RA hat or your BD hat. You just make everything uniformly fiduciary across the board. And then we don't have to worry about what channel everyone is in. And that was actually put forth as one of the options for the SEC to engage in rulemaking as a part of the Dodd-Frank legislation after the financial crisis. It said the SEC was authorized to take up making a new rule that would be no less stringent for broker-dealers than it is for RIAs, i.e. a fiduciary standard. What the SEC ultimately decided to do so was sort of a version of Plan B. So if Plan A is uniform fiduciary duty for all investment advisors and broker-dealers, Plan B is two business models, two standards. We're going to regulate broker-dealers like broker-dealers, and we're going to regulate RIAs like RIAs. Now, obviously, that's what we've been doing already, because broker-dealers are literally subject to different rules than RIAs. And that's kind of the problem that's gotten us here in the first place. And so the conclusion for the SEC was, well, we're not going to make the rules uniform, but we are going to lift up the standards on broker-dealers to be higher than they are right now. And that broker-dealers will be subject to an obligation when making a recommendation to act in the best interest of their customer. And so that's kind of literally where that regulation best interest label came from. It was a new general obligation for brokers that said, when you're making that recommendation, when you're sitting across from a client and making that recommendation, you can't just give them what's suitable, kind of under the old suitability rules. You will have to give something that is in the best interest of the retail customer when making a recommendation. And those are kind of literally the key words that were built into Reg BI. And then there's a new disclosure form called Form CRS, short for Customer Relationship Summary, that is intended to explain, like, here's what it means when you're hiring a broker-dealer that could do transactions and has a best interest in making a recommendation. And here's what it means to work with an RIA who will have a fiduciary obligation with respect to the whole relationship, not just at the time of recommendation.
Yeah, so best interest sure does sound a whole lot like being a fiduciary, because if I say I am a fiduciary, I work in my client's best interest, those sound like the same standards. And I think that's part of the challenge here, right? Is that it is kind of confusing when someone says, yes, I fall under a best interest regulation, and someone says, I'm a fiduciary working in your best interest. They're the same thing, but they're not. And that's been part of the concern and frankly, a lot of the backlash and pushback that the SEC has had from a lot of different consumer advocate groups. Commissioner Clayton said that he wanted to make things clearer for consumers about the differences between broker-dealers and RIAs, and instead came out with a rule that so doesn't make things clearer about the differences. It literally forces the use of the same functional words, which is saying brokers-dealers have this best interest obligation when making a recommendation, and RIAs have a fiduciary obligation to act in the best interest of their clients. And there is kind of a timing difference to this. The broker only has a best interest obligation at the moment of the recommendation itself, not everything else the broker-dealer does as a broker-dealer. But even that distinction is sort of lost on clients and leaves them up to this strange sort of theoretical exercise like,
Well, I don't know. What else could my broker be doing not in my best interest while I'm not sitting across from them receiving recommendations? And, most people don't know how broker dealers work, like the underlying mechanics. So you wouldn't even know to ask questions about like, hey, how did that order routing occur? And what was the payment for order flow you might have taken on the back end? Or, hey, I get that this fund recommendation is in my best interest, but are you only offering the higher share classes because you negotiated a back end payment with the firm in order to get that? And so the SEC kind of took this split approach that said the broker, like the actual person, has to act in the best interest of their client when they make that recommendation and sit across from them. But the broker dealer itself, like the entity that they work for, is under no obligation to change in any way. Like literally doesn't have a best interest standard, does not have a requirements to eliminate their conflicts of interest. Those rules don't actually apply to the broker dealer, just the broker themselves, which we and a lot of others would argue like it doesn't really fix anything. Like in the logical extreme, I can take a firm that manufactures and sells products and pays all commissions and eliminate all the conflicts for brokers and just say, let's make everybody on straight salary, no bonuses whatsoever. Well, we all know at the end of the day that if the only purpose of that brokerage firm is to sell products, the people who keep the salary are the ones who sell the products. And if you don't sell enough, you're going to get fired and you lose your salary. Like the conflict is still there if that's the only way the firm makes money. And the SEC didn't really try to do anything to change the business model of the broker dealer. They just put this additional layer of burden on the broker to hopefully not end out conflicted from their broker dealer's pressure to conflict them.
Yeah. And, we don't have to give the full history lesson, but I do think it's, in the end, this is all rooted in, if you go back to your CFP study days in the Investors Act of 1940, all the way back to where ultimately Congress decided that the SEC should oversee and regulate the giving of investment advice and that all advisors would be fiduciaries when giving advice. And so, all the way back to what was that, 80 years ago, they foresaw that this was an issue and that they wanted to solve. So we have the Investors Act of 1940. We are all going to be fiduciaries when working with clients and giving financial advice. Obviously, advice then was very different. It was pure investment advice. Financial planning hadn't even been created then. It wasn't a concept at that time. But then I guess we already had the advent of the broker dealer, but the brokers were just to broker and deal products. That's all they did.
I mean, in the purest sort of economic capital formation sense, like, if you just got through the Great Depression and you're really optimistic that the economy is going to start growing again in the 1940s, and you've got a great idea for a new national business, but you got to raise what, I don't know, back then probably would have been like $10 million in a public offering of stock. Like just the actual mechanics of how capital formation works. Like if I am a corporation and I want to raise, back then $10 million, today maybe $100 million or billions of dollars. The way it works, I go to an investment banking firm and I said, hey, I want to issue shares to the public. I'm going to put out 100,000 shares at $100 a piece to try to go raise $10 million to build my great vision business of the 1940s. And so the investment banking firm says, sure, we'll help you raise that $10 million of capital. So we're going to figure out how to price the shares. We're going to take them out to the marketplace, and we're going to use the broker dealer that is part of our investment banking business to call individual investors and see if we can find 100,000 investors who will each buy one share of your $100 stock in $1940. And so the challenge of companies that want to raise capital in and become publicly traded companies is at some point you got to figure out how do you go from have millions of dollars of shares need investors to millions of investors who actually own your shares one small piece at a time. And the way that happened is you get a brokerage firm whose job is to call all the investors they know and try to sell your stock to them. Hey, I know about this cool new company. They're going to make a really awesome product. You should buy a share of their stock. And if the brokers knew enough people and had enough people in their book, which back then was a literal physical book of customer names that you could call and sell stocks to, this was how you raise money as a business. And so broker dealers played an absolutely essential function in like the actual economic capital formation process of how a company raised money in public markets. Then, of course, once you issue the stock and you get a broker dealer to help sell and distribute it to the public, if those investors want to sell the shares some point down the road, you need a brokerage firm that operates in the secondary markets that can actually help you sell that share to someone else that wants to buy it, which we now know today is stock exchanges where brokerage firms interact. And so broker dealers then and still now have this really crucial function that they play for, in the most literal sense, the brokering and dealing of investment securities. Like, it's how publicly traded companies get their capital, get the shares in the hands of consumers, and then make sure that those shares have a marketplace where they can be bought and sold so other investors can participate in the process. But broker dealers of the 1940s, or kind of leading up to that, like, that was their deal. Like, they brokered and
that was it.
And they dealt. If you wanted to get individualized investment advice, you would either do that on a pooled basis through registered investment companies, or what we now know as mutual funds, or you would hire what back then was called an investment counselor. Today, we would know them as a financial advisor, who would provide that service for you customized to your individual needs. And so the challenge that they were dealing with even in the 1930s was when brokerage firms went to sell their stocks, at some point it became tempting to say, like, not just, hey, you should buy this company, it's a great company, but like, hey, you should buy this company, it'll make you a lot of money and you'll be able to retire. And it's like, well, wait. Are you giving that person investment counseling retirement advice? Like, no, I'm just selling the stock. Like, I just said it's going to make them a ton of money so they can retire. But like, I'm just selling the stock. And so to kind of draw this line between the two, we created the Investment Advisors Act. And if you actually go and look, like, the Investment Advisors Act as written had two primary purposes. One was to help protect the public by making it clear who's actually in the business of investment advice. And the second was to actually protect investment advisors from not being caught up with what at the time were called tipsters and touts, basically people who were trying really hard to sell a stock and might have gotten a little bit too aggressive in saying it's going to be really great for you and make you millions, and suddenly have it sound like they were giving investment advice when all at the end of the day they were really doing was trying to sell the stock that their company told them to sell. And so the Investment Advisors Act came forward and said, all right, here's going to be the deal going forward. If you provide investment advice, you get compensated for it, and you're in the business of providing that advice, you have to register as an investment advisor. That's the deal. And then you're subject to a fiduciary standard. And then they came up with a list of exclusions to make sure people weren't caught up unnecessarily. So like lawyers and accountants who happened to give advice that touched investments was not deemed to be giving, investment advice as an investment advisor just because you as an accountant said, hey, you're going to have a capital gain if you sell that thing. Certain types of banks and holding companies weren't included. There was an exception for like newspapers and magazines and newsletters of the time that sold kind of investment analysis, because they said, like, look, we're just publishing general investment analysis. We're not making personalized financial advice. And then there was this exception that said any broker or dealer whose performance of brokerage services is solely incidental to the conduct of their business as a broker or dealer. It was sort of this acknowledgement
solely
of like
solely
incidental, right? Like if you're primarily selling a thing, but at some point along the way you say like, hey, it'll make you a lot of money and you retire if you buy the stock I'm selling you. Like, we all get this is not holistic personal financial advice. Like, you're selling a stock, you're only going to pay me if you buy the stock. We all get how this works. Like, it's part of the sales pitch. It is solely incidental to the conduct of business as a broker or dealer, and you're not getting specifically compensated for the advice. In fact, that was specifically part of the rule. It said, any broker or dealer whose performance of those services is solely incidental to their conduct as a broker dealer and who receives no special compensation therefore.
So, and I think, obviously the solely incidental terminology has been abused, let's just say, has been stretched. It created this gray area.
Yeah, and to be fair, like I don't think it actually created such a gray area. I mean, when you go back and look at kind of the rule and what was going on then, and frankly, even what goes on today, it's not that hard to understand. Like, when you're in the business of selling products and you happen to give a little bit of advice that's attached to the product, then it's probably still a sales transaction, so it's not subject. But again, the driving force of the Advisors Act was if you provide advice, you get paid, and you're in the business of providing that advice. So like, it's not a random one-off you hold out to the public that you give advice, then you have to register as an investment advisor. And so the challenge I think we've had is just sort of one of slow and steady creeping over time. Like the first literally 40 or 50 years after this rule came out, like brokers were just brokers, investment advisors were just investment advisors. Like it was crystal clear how far apart that they were. I think the challenge that we've had over the past, probably 40 odd years though, or so, basically since we invented computers and companies started taking these computers and automating what brokers used to do, right? To the point today where I don't call my broker who calls his buddy on the stock exchange floor who waves those tickets up in the air and tries to get my trade executed. Like we just enter into a little computer system, click trade, and a bunch of magical computer things happen. And like 7.2 seconds later, I have the stock. The technology has so automated most of what happens behind the scenes in the execution of a stock trade and what brokers used to do, that brokerage firms kind of got forced up the line. So they started giving a little bit more advice and they started doing a little bit more financial planning. And frankly, they started creating the confusion that we have today where the overwhelming majority of consumers can't understand the difference between a broker dealer and RIA because like it says financial advisor on their business card and I compensate them and they give me advice and I got my financial plan and they've sort of entirely merged together. And the problem is, well, it's not what the original rule said. The rule said as soon as your advice is more than incidental to the sale of your products, you're supposed to register as an investment advisor. And sort of by this ever so slowly migration of the brokerage model over the span of 40 years, we've gotten to the point today where someone works for a broker dealer, puts financial advisor on their business card, delivers a comprehensive financial plan to a client, charges the same ongoing 1% fee to the client, happens to be through a C share of a mutual fund and not an advisory fee, but like gives the plan, uses the advisor title, charges the same compensation, earns the same thing, delivering the same service, and somehow they're still claiming to the SEC, no. All that stuff that I just did as a broker was solely incidental to the sale of my brokerage products.
And it's important to note, I mean, it has been a slow creep. And part of that is, the SEC has been woefully underfunded for decades. And I don't even know if there was energy behind trying to stop this, but not like they had the resources most likely to do it anyway. But the reason registration matters to us and why we're saying, hey, like you have moved past solely incidental, so therefore you must register, is because whenever you register, you are therefore giving advice under a fiduciary standard. When you are giving advice at a solely incidental, it has been historically suitability standard. And so basically the broker dealers have been able to move into this space where they could give financial advice and do so in a non-fiduciary standard. And so moving forward, obviously the SEC, well, I don't know if the SEC Congress realized we had a problem in 2010. So then we have Dodd-Frank. And yep. Let me just say this for all the listeners, politics aside, Michael and I are not going to be on either side of this. In the end, it's the law that we have to work with. So Dodd-Frank comes out to try and solve this problem, or at least get the SEC to solve this problem.
Yep. And so here's kind of how it boiled down. Actually, I have to take one small step back before that. So in the late 1990s, when there's kind of this acknowledgement, growing realization of the problem with brokers and the fact that brokers have this tendency to churn because they've got an incentive to do various transactions, there was a study done at the time. And what the study at the time found, it was called the Tully Report, was if we could get brokers away from getting paid for every transaction and get paid more holistically on an ongoing basis, they don't have as much incentive to churn, right? It's sort of like a duh moment for us now. But like back then, that was sort of a big thing to say, like, hey, even though brokers have been compensated with commissions for the past 100 years for each trade, maybe we should try to wrap all their trades into one ongoing fee so they get the same money no matter how much they trade. And then they'll only try to sell the things that are good and not just try to sell things for the sake of selling things. So the Tully Report had put forth this idea that maybe we should try to get brokerage firms to do more fee-based activity, wrap all the commissions into one ongoing fee instead of per trade. And this led in 1999 to a rule that came out that would allow broker dealers an exemption to charge ongoing wrap fees for brokerage accounts and not have to register as investment advisors, which is normally what would happen if you charge ongoing fees for working with a client. And so there was a big back and forth. The Financial Planning Association ultimately sued them in 2005, won, and the victory in the case meant the SEC couldn't just give this broad-based exemption for broker-dealers to charge ongoing fees and not be investment advisors. They had to actually become investment advisors. And so a year later was the birth of the hybrid movement, right? Today, the overwhelming majority of all advisors at large broker-dealers are hybrids. They're dual registered as investment advisors for that portion of the business and then brokers for the rest of the business. That was virtually unheard of prior to 2008. That was a monstrous shift in the landscape. But what happened was, once we got into that realm, we had what some people know today as the two hat phenomenon. Like, okay, right now I'm wearing my RIA hat, but in a moment I'm going to take off my RIA hat and put on my broker-dealer hat. Or I might actually just be wearing a brokerage hat the whole time, but you're paying me an ongoing fee of 1% and I'm giving you a financial plan anyway, so you wouldn't even know which hat I was wearing because I basically do the same services no matter what. And so that's what had led up, along with the striking down of the broker-dealer exemption in 2007 by the FPA, with this recognition, Congress, you got to do something about this. It's all confused. People can't tell the difference of what's what. The brokers are basically in the advice business. We need a new law for this. And so there was a law powering through Congress at the time. It was Dodd-Frank. It was designed to clean up all of the other financial crisis stuff that was happening. But this issue of the duty that brokers and advisors have to their clients got caught up in it. And the original lobbying from the Financial Planning Coalition, so FPA, NAPFA, and the CFP board was, the brokers and the advisors are basically all doing the same thing. We should just regulate them all as advisors and apply a uniform fiduciary duty. And also in 2010, the Department of Labor put forth its first proposal to say we're going to apply a uniform duty for all brokers and investment advisors. What we ended out with, though, was, well, obviously, as we know, the Department of Labor's rule was ultimately fought back. And the industry lobbied very, very hard against the Dodd-Frank provision. And instead of having Congress just say the SEC is directed to make a new rule that treats broker-dealers and investment advisors the same, instead, what Congress ended out writing was the SEC is directed to do a study. It was called the Section 913 study because this was done under Dodd-Frank Section 913. And if at the end of their study, the SEC decides to do something, they may choose to move forward and create a new standard for broker-dealers that is no less stringent than the one that applies to RIAs. So basically, rather than Congress coming over the top of the SEC and forcing them to do this, Congress gave them the choice.
And now you said may create a rule. So it's not must. It's that the SEC has the option to create this rule. They didn't have to. But if they did create the rule, then it must be no less stringent. That's an accurate interpretation?
Correct. And kind of that parsing is very important because it's turning out that's essentially the center of a whole bunch of the legal action that has come forward now. So Congress kind of left it a little bit open-ended. There were actually two subsections that were attached to this. One was called 913F and one was called 913G. And so the F provision said the SEC has the option to make new rulemaking for broker-dealers or investment advisors. The second section, 913G, then said, and the SEC is the authority to establish a fiduciary duty specifically for broker-dealers and would make one that is no less stringent than what applies for RIAs. And so the part of the debate here that's come up is the SEC says, well, the way we read what Congress wrote was they said you can choose to make a rule and you can separately choose whether or not it's going to be a fiduciary rule that's no less stringent. Other of us that read the provision say, no, these were supposed to be read together. Like the SEC was saying, you can decide to do a rule, and if you do, the rule is supposed to be no less stringent. And so this is what has now created you can call it confusion, like literally the grounds for lawsuits, both that we are filing from XYPN Network and that a coalition of 8 states or 7 states in the District of Columbia to challenge the rule on the basis of we think the interpretation from Congress at the end of the day under Dodd-Frank was if you definitely had the option to make a rule, but if you made a rule, it was supposed to be one that was no less stringent for brokers than investment advisors. You can't cherry pick like one section of the law and completely ignore the other section of the law. And it is certainly clear, like, and the SEC acknowledges it in its own rulemaking process, like regulation best interest standard for brokers is not as stringent as a full fiduciary duty. They acknowledge they did not follow this provision. The SEC seems to believe that they had authority to do that. They think you could read these sections separately. We do not agree. And the states that are challenging the rule do not agree.
So fast forward a little bit, they've issued draft, proposals, and we actually wrote a comment letter. Well, I should say you wrote a comment letter and got my name put on it somehow.
Thank you for joining on that. We appreciate that.
I helped review it, and it got posted on the blog, but submitted to the SEC, and they actually referenced our comment letter 4 or 5 times in the footnotes of the final rule, which means they read it and then decided not to use any of it because they specifically called out why they didn't.
Yes, they referenced our comment letter in explaining why they were not making a uniform fiduciary rule. So I was like, thanks for the acknowledgement. Not quite what we were looking for to get blown off thereafter, but thank you for reading.
Yeah, and nice to know that they actually did read it and ignored it, which is helpful for long term because now we can say, hey, look, they actually looked at it. They knew this was a problem and they chose not to address it throughout the drafting process. It's not like we just showed up at the last minute. But that would have been almost a year ago now.
Correct.
That happened. And so this rule ultimately got passed, back in May-ish?
Yep. Got passed earlier this year, fully finalized in June, but with a 1-year delayed effective date that the rule doesn't actually kick in and start getting enforced until the summer of 2020. But the way the way regulations work, and this was the same thing that happened to the Department of Labor's fiduciary rule and others as well, is when a regulator files a new regulation, there is a 60-day time window under what's called the Administrative Procedures Act, where essentially private industry or anybody else that thinks they're being unfairly harmed by the regulation in a manner that the regulators failed to consider has the ability to sue the regulator to stop the regulation from going forward. So, it's one of those remedies that's created under our system of government to make sure that, regulators don't unwittingly overreach or do something beyond their authority. So in general, regulators are afforded pretty wide latitude to do their regulations. Like that's why they're regulators. That's why they get the authority from Congress to do so. But they still have to make regulations that reasonably follow precedent. If they don't follow precedent, they have to have clear reasons as to why they're doing so. They cannot make rules that are, quote, arbitrary and capricious. And they have to ultimately make rules within their rulemaking authority, which means things like if Congress said you had to make a rule where the standard for brokers is no less stringent than RIAs, you can't make up your own version of the rule that doesn't follow what Congress told you to do. That would be outside of your authority to just, hijack the process off in your own direction. And so that becomes the basis for our lawsuit, and kind of why it got filed when it did was, we were at the end of that 60-day window, having spent most of that 2 months analyzing the situation and trying to figure out if we had reasonable grounds to challenge this. But ultimately, we decided that we did, and it turned out we weren't the only ones. A number of state regulators decided the same thing, and they filed suit as well.
Yeah, and to your point around, you have to write rules within your purview. Ultimately, that's why Department of Labor fiduciary rule got thrown out, was because they basically said the DOL overstepped into an area that wasn't their right there.
Yes, well, and the irony, if you actually go out and pull out the legal briefs that the industry filed, it's like the broker dealer lobbying organizations and the insurance and annuity industry lobbying associations, the actual grounds that the Department of Labor's rule got thrown out was the broker dealers and the insurance companies successfully convinced the courts that the people who work in their firms are not advisors, provide no substantive advice, that none of their clients could ever be confused as being in a relationship of trust and confidence with someone that works at a broker dealer or an insurance company. And because their people are purely and only salespeople and don't do any advice and don't have the trust and confidence of their clients, it would be unfair for the Department of Labor to regulate them like advisors because they're not.
Yeah, it was really nice for them to be very clear
that
our people are not advisors.
I mean, it's a strange, I understand why they did it, because they didn't want to have to answer to all the fiduciary rules. But the irony is what the insurance and broker dealer lobbying organizations said about their own people is actually worse than what a lot of other industry people and consumer groups say about at least certain broker dealers and insurance companies that push the limits. They essentially threw all of their own people under the bus to insist They were absolutely nothing more than salespeople. And because the Department of Labor is only supposed to regulate advisors and not salespeople, that's why they got the DOL rule thrown out. The overreach was you shouldn't be able to apply advice rules to pure salespeople at broker-dealers and insurance companies, everything they write on their business cards and in their marketing notwithstanding.
So addressing the lawsuit itself and sort of the two areas that we're focused on, one of which the state attorney generals are also focused on, and then a second one. So let's start with the first one, which we've mentioned already, which is around this rulemaking. And sort of what we're challenging is whether or not you read those two instructions independently or dependently. So talk to me a little bit about that.
Correct. So there's ultimately two kind of thrusts that we're taking with the lawsuit and our challenge. The first is essentially the same thing that the states are doing as well, which is we're coming back and saying, all right, there were two pieces under Dodd-Frank, Section F that said the SEC can make a rule, and Section G that gave the SEC the authority to make that rule no less stringent for brokers than it is for investment advisors. We think those were supposed to be read together, and it essentially meant if you make a rule, it's got to be a fiduciary rule for brokers. The SEC has read them separately. It was an either or. And we're kind of making the case like, well, if it was going to be an either or, you didn't even need, Congress didn't even need to make a rule. You can change the rules for brokers anytime you want. I mean, it's the SEC. They've always had that authority. The whole point of the study in Dodd-Frank and then the follow-up authority was the study was supposed to figure out if you're going to make brokers fiduciaries, and then you got the authority to make brokers fiduciaries. So just doing the rulemaking part, but not doing the fiduciary part doesn't follow the actual authority that was granted under Dodd-Frank. And so the first piece we're challenging on is the same as the states, who essentially are alleging the same thing and making the same argument. We're still both putting it forward, not just because we submitted our own lawsuits and did it on our own time, although we had actually been tipped off that the states were going to be doing something as well. But we also put it forward because there's actually two things that really go into successfully challenging a regulator. The first is essentially the merits of your argument itself. Like, hey, we think the SEC got it wrong. Court, go back and you read Congress, and here's how we think you're supposed to read it, and you tell us if you agree. Like, that's essentially what the merits of the legal arguments will come down to is administratively, can we convince a judge that they are supposed to read it the way we read it and not the way the SEC reads it? The second part that goes with successfully challenging a regulator, though, is you have to, in order to take them to court in the first place, you have to prove that you would directly be harmed by this regulation. It's called having standing. You have to actually have standing to sue the regulator. And it's nothing nefarious. It's just meant to recognize, like, geez, if any random person could sue any random regulator just because they didn't like the rule, like our system of government would grind to a halt because someone always doesn't like any regulation. Lots of people usually don't like any regulation because regulations are controversial, even if they're good regulations. There's almost always someone with an adverse interest. And so a key part of challenging regulations is, in essence, you have to be able to demonstrate, I am a stakeholder in this system. And I'm not just saying I think this was an unfair regulation. I believe this is an unfair regulation that is directly harming me personally. And therefore, I have standing to get in front of a court and say, the regulator is harming me and the court has to do something about this. And it's not necessarily meant to be greedy for the person per se, but the court doesn't want to hear random people that just don't like a rule. If you want to prove your point, you got to show you're harmed. And so that's called the standing argument. And it's important because states actually have trouble challenging regulations over standing. What's going to happen for this coalition of states is at some point, the SEC is going to say, hey, I'm not sure if those state attorney generals actually have standing. And the states are going to have to show up in court and explain why their state is harmed. It's like, well,
which is tough.
Which is tough. I mean, when you get down to like a very literal state scenario, like you, Mr. Attorney General, like, do you personally have a broker that's going to harm you in this? Like, well, no, I do my own stuff. Like, well, okay, can you provide a list of all the citizens who live in your state and the approximate amount of damages that they will experience from this new rule? Well, like, well, oh no, we have a lot of citizens and they do a lot of different things. Like, how on earth am I supposed to do that? the actual mechanics of how as a state is kind of this semi-ephemeral entity with lots of different people doing lots of different things in your territory to prove that a regulation will harm you is actually a difficult thing. And there's a bunch of nuanced legal precedents about how states can make that case for a wide range of regulator issues, but it's actually a big question mark. And this is why historically it tends to be industry players that do these lawsuits. So, when the last fiduciary rule came through that was going to give a big exemption for brokers to give advice without registering as investment advisors, it was the Financial Planning Association that sued as an industry stakeholder. And even when the industry challenged the Department of Labor's fiduciary rule, it was a number of the insurance and broker-dealer lobbying organizations that actually came forward and were the ones who challenged the rule itself. So it tends to be industry participants because it's easier for them to prove standing because they can come forward and say, like, I do this in the industry and this rule harms me directly because of this. And so I can prove I've got standing and that my business will be harmed by this inappropriate, unfair, arbitrary, capricious, exceeding authority regulation or whatever argument you attach to it. And so part of the reason why we're suing in parallel to the states with essentially the same Dodd-Frank argument is it's not just sort of a redundant thing. It's possible that we'll be the only ones that ever actually get to make that case in court because there's a risk that the states won't get through the standing issue.
Yeah, that really answers the question that people have asked me and asked both of us is just like, well, if you knew the states were going to file,
Yep.
The states filed before us, why piggyback on it? Like, what's the point? Is it just for PR?
No, it's because they might not even get their day in court.
Exactly. And so, in the end, we felt like someone from industry needed to do this. And in order to be able to provide that standing that the states may ultimately lose out on.
Yep.
And I think that's that's another question that comes up that folks have said, like, why is XY Planning Network, a privately owned company, the one suing on behalf of industry? If you look back at the SEC rule that you mentioned earlier, or Department of Labor, any of these, like, it wasn't a single company that showed up and did this. And I'll say that this really wasn't our goal. If we're being honest, our goal wasn't to be the company that had to sue the SEC.
No, not at all.
But through conversations, we realized no one else was going to do it. And I still don't actually have a good answer from the associations, from industry, if you will, from the coalition, from FPA, from NAFA, like why they didn't. If it was that they just felt like they just didn't have a good enough case, that they felt like, this was sort of a done deal. I
don't think anybody has managed to answer that. I mean, particularly as to why FPA didn't. I mean, they were literally the ones who did it last time. Suing regulators is not cheap, but they certainly have the financial resources to be able to do it at the size that FPA is with 22,000 odd members. The real question that's loomed out there that just no one has answered, even the FPA actually has not answered, is why they didn't sue, why they didn't participate, why they didn't get involved in this from an advocacy end, particularly because they were the lead the last time. I mean, they were the ones that drove the whole thing from start to finish and won the case and had no problem getting standing and were able to drive the legal arguments all the way through. Arguably, it might have been a little harder for NAPFA just as a smaller organization with less resources, just kind of monetarily and staff-wise. FPA is almost 10x the size of NAPFA in member count and staff count. And it's not really the CFP board's place. I did hear from a couple of people as well ask, like, why didn't the CFP board do it? We often talk about the CFP board as though we're members of the CFP board because we pay our CFP dues, but technically we pay a CFP licensing fee to license the CFP trademark from the CFP board. It is not a membership association, and like legally it's not. FPA and NAPFA are organized as what are called 501c6 associations. So they're nonprofits that operate as membership associations. The CFP board is literally by legal entity. It is not a C6 membership association. It is a C3 charity, 501c3 charity that operates for the benefit of the public by issuing the CFP marks and making sure that people who use the CFP marks are held to CFP board standards. And so again, getting back to that standing issue, it would be very hard for a charity that owns a CFP trademark to make the business case for standing. just from a very like technical, literal legal sense. Much more straightforward for an association to do it. And the one that had the resources to do it was FPA. That's literally why they did it last time. And still no one knows why they didn't beyond they didn't.
Yeah, pretty much the only answer that I have been able to glean from reading between the lines is just this just wasn't on their radar. This wasn't something that was on their radar. Their policy folks just either ignored it or missed it or didn't care, whatever it was. But I think the FPA did not even know that there was a deadline for filing against this regulation that they missed.
Yeah, I mean, just when the lawsuit came out, the public, the public comments from the FPA spokesperson was essentially like, well, we're considering our options. And that was the statement they made to the media 5 days after the deadline. And so it's like, what options would you be considering at this point? Because the deadline passed 5 days ago. You had 2 months and the deadline's over now. So, we can only kind of speculate why they didn't. I mean, I think realistically, if FPA was, serving on behalf of the profession with its mission and challenge this rule the way that they challenged the last one, I don't think we would have been suing the SEC as well. FPA could have done it. We certainly would have filed legal briefs and given our own supporting arguments, but FPA would have no problem getting standing, as I think we'll be fine on standing. And the legal arguments. Like you don't need 10 people to sue a regulation. If you've got a winning argument, you just need one who can run the ball all the way to the end. And again, we're concerned the states might not be able to because of the standing issue. So that's why XYPN Network decided to take a stand. And we certainly know the legal arguments well because I've spent way too many hours of my life reading these and all of the legal and regulatory history, including the kind of the second prong of why we're challenging the SEC, which we'll get to in a moment. But like we didn't need multiple people who have a great chance at standing to sue the SEC. We only needed one. But we're concerned the states aren't going to be able to get to the end. And FPA wasn't doing anything. And so we felt like we had to fill the void and do something on behalf of the financial planning community.
So, yeah, I mean, I know sometimes, Michael, you catch some flack for being anti-FPA, which I can assure people is not true.
No, like it should be a 50,000 member association. The only thing I don't like about the FPA is that they're not twice the size that they are because they should be.
So people can hear it from me. I have my own opinions, my own voice on this. The FPA failed in this one. So when people ask, why did you do it? The answer is because the FPA failed their obligation to the industry to protect consumers. So I'll say it and I'll get an email about it. So here we go. Cool. So moving on, you mentioned that, and we said earlier, there was a second reason or sort of a second piece of standing that we added in that the states did not add into their legal argument to see if, quite frankly, if one doesn't work, maybe the other will. So
and so the second kind of basis that we're challenging the SEC on regulation best interests is just the original Investment Advisors Act of 1940 and this solely incidental provision that's in there in the first place. The SEC in the final version of its rule actually said, well, we've never really fully defined solely incidental. So we're going to go ahead and define it now for the first time in 79 years. And the way that they defined it was they said, well, advice is solely incidental for a broker if it is reasonably related to or in connection with their sale of brokerage products. And so we kind of get this key language, reasonably related to or in connection with. So basically
so helpful, so specific.
So if you gave advice, but you were still selling brokerage services at the end, it's connected to the brokerage services, so it's okay. Impliedly, even then, if you give a financial plan, but it's in connection with the sale of brokerage products, then you're still ultimately a broker. And you don't have to register as investment advisor and deal with all the fiduciary stuff. And we just fundamentally don't think that's it's literally not what the words solely incidental mean. If anything you do that's connected with brokerage services qualifies, you wouldn't even need a solely incidental provision. You could just say any advice is permitted as long as you sell a product at the end, because that's what you end out with if you allow anything that is reasonably related to and in connection with the sale of brokerage services. And so we think the SEC is just basically defined solely incidental in a way that makes the whole provision meaningless, because anything that's associated with the sale of a product then would mean you are exempt from investment advisor registration. And one of the key things actually about how regulators get challenged is you're not allowed to interpret the words of Congress in a way that would make their words meaningless. Like you can't interpret a congressional provision out of existence. If Congress wrote it there, you have to assign it some kind of weighty meaning. And the fact that Congress went out of their way to specifically create a solely incidental exemption for brokers who get paid to sell products means it has to mean something more than just you're exempt as long as you sell a product, because otherwise everything would be exempt and brokers could just do whatever they want and provide whatever advice they want. And Congress wrote the solely incidental provision for a reason. And so like this.
So why this matters, I guess it's like just highlighting like why does this really matter for advisory firms? So just to use a metaphor, because I think it helps to connect these dots because it starts to get a little mind numbing even for me. And we've talked about this for months. Let's just take out of the financial planning world and let's go into medical field. So I go see my doctor and I say, hey, my knee is hurting from running a race, and she prescribes me something and we're good to go. She is my fiduciary. She's working in my best interest. She's taking care of me. That's great. But what if my doctor is also working for a pharmaceutical company? And by simply working for a pharmaceutical company, when I walk in there, I may or may not even be aware of that relationship. But when I sit down, she looks at my knee, she says, hey, you need an MRI and a knee brace and all of these drugs that I'm going to sell you through my pharmaceutical rep here. Oh, and I'm not your fiduciary actually right now. She doesn't have to say that because she says I'm working in your best interest under best interest regulation, but I'm not actually your fiduciary.
And in fact, I get a huge bonus if I sell the company's anti-inflammatory drug for your knee.
Exactly. And so that is the fundamental challenge that Reg BI has introduced, is that two people who both call themselves financial advisors, who are both providing what appears to be a very similar service. They are both charging a fee for that service. It's no longer just that, I didn't charge for it, so therefore it's okay. They can both get paid for the service, but because one is associated with a broker-dealer and therefore can sell a product, they do not have to register as an RIA. They do not fall under RIA regulations, and therefore they do not have to act as a fiduciary. That's the fundamental issue that we face now.
Yeah. And so for us, like the whole point of this separation, like the whole purpose of this Investment Advisors Act, really, when you get down to it, was essentially to create the same version of this separation that exists for doctors, which is, look, the doctor can prescribe the drugs, but the doctor doesn't work for the drug company. And it's not to say that like the drugs are bad and people shouldn't get the drugs. And in our context of our industry, like it's not to say that insurance investment products are bad and that you shouldn't be able to get the insurance investment products and that an advisor might not write you a prescription for them, but that the prescription doesn't come from someone who works for the drug company, or in our case, the product manufacturer. It comes from someone that's separate. And that's kind of the nature of independent fiduciary advice. That's how it exists in the medical field. And that was what the 40 Act created. And so the concern is the way Congress is rewriting the rules now, you can take two people. So if I come in off the street and I just say, hey, I want to get paid to deliver someone a financial plan. So if I go and make that financial plan and I give it to a client and the client pays me, I have to register as an investment advisor, right? That's kind of the registration environment. That plan's got anything in there about investment advice, I got to register as an investment advisor. Now under Reg BI, if I produce the same plan, I earn the same money, but I happen to make the money because I sell one of my company's proprietary products. Now that financial plan and all the advice I gave is in connection with my sale of a brokerage product. And so suddenly, same advice, same plan, same marketing, same communication to the client, but it happens to end with my company's proprietary product. I no longer have to be a fiduciary under Reg BI. And so bizarrely, like not only was it not a fiduciary standard and not lift brokers up to a fiduciary standard, the way that the SEC reinterpreted solely incidental, if I just do the same planning and I sell products, I actually get to have a lower standard because I can claim all of my planning work is connected to my product sale, which is kind of backwards. Like normally, if you're going to attach a conflicted sale to advice, you apply a higher standard, like you get more stringent because the advice has a potential conflict of interest. And instead, the way the SEC wrote regulation best interest, if you just attached a product sale to your financial plan, you get a lower standard for the same plan. And it's just, we don't think that in any way, shape, or form is consistent with just the original Investment Advisors Act. And the whole point was, if you get compensated for advice, it doesn't even matter if it's a fee or commission. If you get compensated for advice, you're supposed to register as an investment advisor. Like, that's been the rule for 79 years. And the SEC doesn't get to just reinterpret that line.
And that's honestly where our standing comes from, is being able to look at that and say, by being able to compete with a registered investment advisor, but without registering and giving, conflicted advice with the sale of a product, but not having followed our fiduciary standard, but being able to call it the same thing. In the end, that harms our advisors, and as a business, therefore, that harms us. I will say our focus here is that we want to be sure that consumers are protected. We believe consumers deserve to know and have a right to know whether or not the person they are talking to is a salesperson or an advisor, and if they are receiving advice, that it falls under a fiduciary standard. But in the end, the SEC has basically chosen to ignore both laws, both Investors Act of 1940 and Dodd-Frank of 2010, and basically just sort of do what the brokers wanted, which was do a little bit, make it look like we did something, get a pat on the back, but in the end, actually introduce even more problems than we had before.
Well, and to be fair, I think it is worth noting, like, regulation in best interest is a higher standard for broker-dealers than what we had before. It still allows them to preserve some conflicts. It did not clean up everything, but it is a higher standard than what was there before for suitability, which I think is largely why the SEC was patting itself on the back around this. And it's not a full fiduciary duty, which is why broker-dealers were really happy to see it, because they were afraid of what was going to happen with the fiduciary rule. But the problem, again, if you get back to essentially the combination of the Investment Advisors Act of 1940 and the Dodd-Frank Act of 2010, it was essentially said, look, Congress says you have two choices. Option one, you make the rules exactly the same, which was Dodd-Frank. Option two, you keep them completely separate, but advisors are advisors and brokers only do brokering, which was the 40 Act. So, like, either keep them really separate or make them exactly the same. And the issue with Reg BI was the SEC did neither. Like, it split the difference. It said, we're not going to require brokers to be clearly separate, but we're not going to make them fully fiduciary either. We're just going to make them closer. And when the whole problem is consumers are already confused because they can't tell the difference between brokers and investment advisors, making them closer is worse. Like, it is a higher standard for brokers, but when the point was either make them the same or make them clearly different, making them closer is just worse. And that's essentially why we're suing under both Dodd-Frank and the 40 Act. Like, the SEC could have chosen either path, but choosing neither defeats the whole purpose and literally contradicts the laws as written.
And they did the study with their, you said CRS or CSR form, and consumers are more confused after reading it and trying to figure out who are they talking to and what is that form trying to tell them. So yeah, we've introduced even more confusion, more conflicts, and ultimately that's what drove the decision. So we have filed the lawsuit, and now we are in what can only be described as legal limbo.
Yes.
So let's talk about sort of next steps and what people can expect. We will be giving updates to XYPN members, and we'll try to do this publicly as well as updates and change happen. But what's sort of next? What is this process going to look like?
So like, now we are in just the horrifically messy administrative process of how you actually legally sue a regulator. So, as I said, there's kind of two parts. The part two, that is kind of what everybody expects, but actually comes at the end, is giving all of the legal merits of your argument and trying to convince a judge of, hey, I think the SEC did it wrong and they exceeded their authority. The part that comes before that is you got to prove you have standing in the first place to actually bring the lawsuit and show that you were damaged, so that you can say, I'm a stakeholder in this case and I should get to bring the lawsuit. But there's actually a step that comes even before that. And the step that comes before that is, so we have lots of different courts in the US. We have local courts, we have district courts, there are appeals courts that go all the way up to the Supreme Court. And so one of the questions that comes up anytime a regulator is being challenged is, which court are you going to take this argument to? And so sometimes you kind of have the choice to essentially shop around for jurisdictions, like, hey, I think I can make the case well in this jurisdiction. It has judges that have tended to be, favorable towards consumer advocates challenging regulators. So I think we're going to go after and see if we can hopefully get one of those judges that will be slightly more likely to rule in our favor. And there are just some jurisdictional rules about where you're supposed to put your challenges in the first place. And so that's become part of what's kicked off what actually for the next few months is going to be a whole bunch of jurisdiction wrangling. So Dodd-Frank itself had a provision in there that essentially said, if you got a problem with something based on these Dodd-Frank rules, you're supposed to sue in district court. The Investment Advisors Act actually has a provision that says if you got an issue with something that the SEC does under this law, you're supposed to file in the appeals court. And so we actually already have this little bit of conflict of, well, are we going to sue in district courts or are we going to sue in appeals courts? And if we're going to do those, you actually get to choose which of the appeal circuits you're going to go to or which of the district courts are you going to go to. And so right now, the phase of the case is actually the jurisdiction fight. So we started with district court because that's where Dodd-Frank says you're supposed to sue. That's where the states filed, and that's where we filed. And we particularly chose the Southern District of New York because it is one of those district courts that has at least some reputation of supporting consumer advocates overreaching regulators. Now, the initial response from the court so far already has been, yeah, we're actually not sure we have jurisdiction to hear this because of all the messy interstate issues that are involved. We think you might have to take this to the appeals court. And so over the next few weeks, basically our lawyers and the state's lawyers will be filing legal briefs to try to explain why we think these Dodd-Frank issues should be heard in the Southern District of New York and not bumped up to the appeals court. It's not necessarily a bad thing if we get to this sent to the appeals court because we're actually supposed to do the Investment Advisors Act portion of this in the appeals court. And we are even looking at the possibility that we take like a split approach where the states can do the Dodd-Frank argument in the district courts while we do the Investment Advisors Act arguments in the appeals courts, except if it turns out Dodd-Frank's the winning argument and the states lose on standing, we actually have to go back to the district court because we're the only ones who can make the Dodd-Frank argument if the states don't succeed. So as you gather from this, there's kind of this really funky interweaving web of which of the courts do we go to, and are we going to be the ones that run the ball, or are the states going to be the ones that run the ball, or are we both going to run them in parallel in case someone loses on standing, or are we going to go different places? And there is kind of a clock ticking on this because there is always a danger just anytime regulators are being challenged that if the case draws out too long and the regulations go into full effect and the whole industry changes in response, courts are less likely to throw out the rule because they're going to say, look, this may or may not have been a good rule, but apparently the whole industry already adjusted. And so we can't send them back because that would actually be even more harmful to the industry because now you've got two changes instead of one. And so you'll probably see some additional news coverage. Some people actually saw the initial news announcement that essentially Southern District of New York was rejecting our case and was sending us back to make a jurisdiction argument. It doesn't actually mean the case was over or thrown out or anything like that in sort of the truest, like, it's over now. It was the judge simply throwing it back and saying, I'm not actually sure this is supposed to be in my jurisdiction. So y'all either have to show that I'm supposed to be the judge that hears this or take it up with the appeals court and you can do it there. And so the jurisdiction battle will probably actually be the thing that drives for the next month or two. And at some point, we'll get settled down on jurisdiction. Then there'll be a few months of battling back and forth on standing and making sure that we can show we have standing. And it's actually probably not until late winter or early spring that we may even get to the point where we get to make the actual argument on its merits of here's why we think the SEC overreached. And so it's just kind of the reality of how these lawsuits wind through is it takes a while to go through all the different steps. And we're on the jurisdiction step now. Next will be the standing step. Then we get to the merits, and then we find out whether the court agrees.
And this is why I am so glad that I did not become a lawyer.
And this is why I kind of feel like maybe I lost my second calling as a lawyer. But here I am. I'm in the advisor industry. I'm here to stay. I'm not going to drop out of advisor world for going back to law school.
You can add JD to the end of all of those letters.
Oh, wouldn't that be glorious?
Well, thank you, Michael, for the history lesson on a lot of this. I think this just helps give overall context as to how we got here. Ultimately, what led to this lawsuit? Why did XYPN ultimately file? And I think it's worth closing out with what is our end goal? And that's been a question. And in the end, we want to see the giving of financial advice, registered investment advisor, and done under a fiduciary standard. And there may be a couple of ways that gets done. Some news articles came out saying, oh, Michael just wants the rule amended. which was very much a
No, yeah.
not a quote. And so there are a couple ways that could get done. The rule can just get thrown out, assuming we win.
And then we go back to the drawing board and we all try to make another rule
that hopefully we don't have to sue over. So it sort of starts the clock over for the SEC. The alternative is the SEC says, hey, look, you're right. We'll amend to remove a couple of these pieces, but the rest of the rule stays, in which case we can make the decision on if we're satisfied with that and want to ultimately withdraw our lawsuit.
So, one of the paths to this, in 2005, when this happened back and forth, and the FPA was the one that was kind of point on the lawsuit, the SEC actually put forth a version of their broker-dealer exemption rule that said, all right, we get it. You're concerned that if brokers are giving some advice and they're charging for these fee-based wrap accounts, that it kind of looks like they're being an RIA and they should register as a fiduciary, even though we gave them an exemption. And so the SEC put forth kind of a gimme to the FPA. And what they wrote in the 2005 rule was, look, if someone holds out as a financial planner, gives a financial plan, and provides financial planning services, we're going to automatically assume that is not solely incidental and will require registration as an investment advisor. So, if someone just does a fee-based wrap account, literally to only scoop up the trades, we're still going to let them have an exemption. But if they try to do that with a financial plan attached, they actually have to be registered investment advisors and fiduciaries, and would have put all financial planning activity under the RIA umbrella and pulled it out of broker-dealers. Now, ultimately, the FPA proceeded with its lawsuit because there were a lot of other problems with the broker-dealer exemption rule for fee-based accounts besides just that. But sort of the weird irony is that when the FPA won its lawsuit to get the problem stuff thrown out of that broker-dealer exemption, the whole rule got thrown out, including this absolutely wonderful financial planning provision. I think would have largely ameliorated our concerns. Because if you take all the financial planning and require all of that to be done solely as a fiduciary, there's not much left aside from essentially being a broker giving a tip, which is fine. Like, that was the point of the solely incidental rule in the first place was, look, loose tips are tied to a stock sale. We all get that you're just trying to sell the stock. Pull the financial planning out, make it fiduciary as it should be. And so the other option, I think, in essence, is if the SEC wants to bring that rule back and put that back on the table, I think that would largely ameliorate our concerns because it would do what we ultimately believe is most important, which is make sure that financial planning is delivered as a fiduciary. So if I can give a plan and then get out of fiduciary duty because I sold a product at the end, you shouldn't get a lower standard because you sell a product. In fact, you should have more scrutiny if you sell a product. But if the SEC wants to reinstitute that 2005 provision that got thrown out that said giving a plan, providing planning services, or holding out as a financial planner triggers investment advisor registration and puts all the financial planning advice on the RIA side of the business, we think that actually solves the consumer concern and puts financial planning where it belongs. And so if that comes out, there's really no way to get the SEC to do it. I mean, they make their own rules on their own time. But if they decide that they want to try to do that, we probably back off the lawsuit at that point because I don't think we really want to just kill the lawsuit for the sake of the lawsuit. The point at the end of the day is financial planning should be fiduciary through and through.
So I'm assuming at least one lawyer from the SEC just listened to that. So there you go.
Who knows?
Awesome. Well, like I said, we have a year to a year and a half of legal wrangling and maneuvering through the courts. It's going to be a fun ride. So Michael, thanks again for coming on the show and helping talk through sort of the history of how Reg BI came to be and ultimately why we've decided to spend the money to try and get this rule overturned on behalf of consumers and what our ultimate goals are. So thanks for coming on the show.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. It's good to be back.
XYPN Network's annual benchmarking survey is out. Are you curious about the average number of clients XYPN members get in their first year, or how successful niches really are? To answer these burning questions and more, we've again enlisted a professional research firm to complete our annual benchmarking study. Get your copy hot off the press and discover vital statistics such as the median advisor revenue by years in practice and sources of firm growth, from referrals to blogging, social media, and more. Head over to xyplanningnetwork.com/study to purchase your copy today. Be sure to join our VIP community at xyplanningnetwork.com/VIP to hang out with other XYPN radio listeners, ask questions for future mailbag episodes with myself and Kitces, and to finally find a community of like-minded financial advisors. Thanks so much for joining me today. We'll see you next time.
You're not alone, and you're not crazy. It's scary starting, building, and growing your own financial planning firm. And that's why we put together a free private community just for you, the Cutting Edge Financial Planner. Go to xyplanningnetwork.com/VIP or text XYPN Radio to 33344 and join a network of thousands ready to change the lives of Gen X and Gen Y clients.